Before the glittering eyes of the royal court, the crown prince rose, his voice sharp as steel, and commanded the lowly chambermaid to kneel. Draped in velvet and gold, he stood above her like a judge hungry for obedience, while she, plain in her worn gown, trembled, yet did not bow. Murmurs rippled through the hall, scandal building, as the arrogant heir demanded her humiliation as a warning to all. But the girl lifted her chin, and with just 3 words, shattered the silence and left the prince himself without breath. And in that instant, the game of power and forbidden desire truly began. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. Beeswax and smoke braided the air of the great hall, candle flames shivering along the gilt and the mirrors until the light looked like heat rising from a road. Nobles sat in their powdered dignity on either side of the aisle, lace and brocade arranged like armor. The throne-like chair on its low dais waited beneath the grand canopy, crimson against old stone. Below it, a boy in livery stood with his cap clutched to his chest, his eyes fixed on the floor as though it might swallow him and spare the rest. Clara kept her place with the other servants along the wall. Her apron was newly laundered, the starch scratched at her waist, where her hands pressed flat. A girl beside her drew a shallow breath and then held it, the kind of breath people keep when the room belongs to someone else. It did. The hall belonged, in every inch and echo, to the prince who would soon sit and make his will the only weather that mattered. She watched the boy. He was not much younger than she was when she first learned to fold sheets in silence, to move without sound, to carry a tray with her eyes lowered and all the breakable things perfectly balanced. His jaw trembled. He swallowed so hard she could hear the click of it even across the stone. A voice announced the charge, not loud but trained to cut. A silver candlestick, missing from the antechamber since last night's supper, discovered in a servant's pallet at dawn. Theft from the royal household. There were no words for fear in rooms like this. There were only the long, tasteful silences that made the skin under your clothes feel too tight. Clara's fingers tightened and then loosened. She had seen where candlesticks were kept and how they were polished, how they were carried away 2 by 2, how they returned in pairs. The pairs mattered. The sets mattered. The flicker of a missing twin haunted the edges of your sight until you made it right. She knew that, and she knew the boy's face did not look like ownership. It looked like someone who had carried what he should not have been made to carry. The doors at the far end opened without a creak. People rose as the prince entered with the mild rustle of habit. He was not tall among men, but the space fitted itself around him as if it had been cut to his measurements. Clara had set foot in this hall 100 times and had never seen it look as small as it did when he took his place. He wore no crown, only a coat that made light act differently when it struck him. He sat, and the room sat with him. Even the candles seemed to hold their breath. "Who speaks for the household?" he said. The answer came. Procedure. Words that made the hearing official, like putting a stamp to wax. The boy raised his head at last because he had to. A guard gave the smallest nudge to his shoulder, a kindness hidden inside a threat. Clara shifted her weight. It would be easier, so much easier, to let it run its course. The hall was built for that too, for letting events crash along the floor like a tide and going home after, carrying what you carried, telling yourself that no tide could be stopped by a single hand. But the edge of wrongness had caught under her skin when she heard pallet and candlestick. There were rooms where servants slept, and there were petty jealousies and jumbled piles, and there were hands that moved because someone told them to. Things ended up where they did not belong for reasons that never reached this dais. It was not the right thing that set her heart to beating hard enough that she felt it in her throat. It was the thought of that boy's mother, if she had one, and the look that would live in her eyes after today. The prince's gaze moved over the hall like a blade, slicing the surface of a lake. When it passed in Clara's direction, her breath caught. Not from beauty, though people called him that, and maybe he was, from focus. He was a man who had learned to focus like a habit, and habits like that could unmake you. "Bring the evidence," he said. The silver candlestick was lifted from a table by the aisle and brought forward on a tray. There was a smudge along one side, a thumb's trace, imperfect and human against a thing that looked like it had been born polished. The tray trembled in the footman's hands. "Step forward," the prince said to the boy. Clara's mouth was dry. She swallowed and felt nothing change. It would be a lie to say she thought of consequences and chose to ignore them. She did not think that far. The urge to move reached her feet and pushed. She stepped out of line. The girl beside her made a sound like a laugh swallowed whole. Heads turned, slow at first, and then in a rush that made the air in front of Clara feel like a wall she had walked into. She stopped in the aisle, not far from the tray with the single candlestick, and folded her hands to hide their unsteadiness. She did not know what her face looked like from the dais. She knew what a maid's face should look like. Humble. Smoothing itself flat, like a sheet pulled tight over a mattress so the test of a coin dropped would bounce. Her face did not feel like that. "Your Highness," she said, because there were forms, and she had been made to learn them. "If I might speak." There was a tiny pause. It might have been the echo. It might have been the prince choosing whether to let the idea grow. A murmur rose like wind against a shut door and then fell. He looked at her as if she had put a hand on his sleeve. He did not like to be touched. "Speak," he said, and the word could have been a permission or an order. The difference, in this room, was only in the listener. Clara tried to keep her voice from trembling and did not quite succeed. "The candlestick." Her eyes flicked to it and back. "There were two. Always two. They are returned together. If one is found where it should not be, it is because it was taken from its pair by someone who would know better than a boy. This is a mistake." She heard her own audacity as if someone else's mouth had formed it. The court did too. A woman coughed delicately, not from illness. The prince did not move. He did not smile. He did not scowl. He watched her with the kind of attention that made the space behind her shoulders feel exposed. He glanced down at the tray, and then at the boy, whose hands had begun to shake so visibly that the guard stopped hiding his pity. "You suggest," the prince said, "that what looks like theft is misplacement." Clara nodded. "Yes. That someone has lied." She opened her mouth and closed it. "That someone has erred, or has used another's bed to hide their error from notice." The word bed made half a dozen people sniff. Beds were private. Beds were not meant to be brought into a hall in speech, not by a maid. The prince leaned back an inch, enough to signal that he could lean forward later, if he chose, and that would be worse. "You risk much to correct what you call an error." She did not dare glance at the boy. "I am telling the truth." "Your truth," he said, and there was a softness to the way he set the words down, as if he had found something interesting at last in a game grown dull. He could have ended it there. He could have let her down, as kings and princes did, and grown bored with generosity. He stood instead. When he rose, people rose with him because their bodies knew the way better than their heads did. Even the boy moved, as if a string had been attached to his spine. The prince descended the few steps of the dais at a measured pace. Clara watched the set of his shoulders, the way his hand hung by his side, relaxed and empty. She watched the faces of the nobles as he passed. Appetite, irritation, a flicker of fear that something might happen without their consent. He stopped 2 arms lengths away. The room's breath drew in. The trees outside the high windows were still bare. The light through leaded glass made everything look edged with lace. "On your knees," he said quietly. Her heart hit her ribs. For a moment, the pain at the base of her throat felt like a sob but was not. The words were simple, a command meant to keep the world in its neat, crushing order, servants in their place, nobility with its pleasures and its invariants. A prince must not be defied inside his own house, not before the people whose fear made every day run smoothly. Clara looked at the floor. at the faint stain in the old stone where thousands of shoes had polished the grit into shine, where male heels had marked out dominion in maps only visible if you had been made to clean them. A knee on this stone would not just be pain in skin, it would be a mark in her that would never wash out. She could get up after. She could serve again. She could move trays in darkness and lie down at night and tell herself there was no other way. It would live inside her like a bruise that never healed. He waited. He did not flex his authority loudly. He did not need to. A hush layered itself over the hall. Somewhere, a log split in the fireplace at the far end with a sound that was almost like a protest. Clara raised her head. She let herself look at him fully for the first time. He had a face trained into composure, but there were shadows at the edges of his eyes. Fatigue, perhaps. The skin at his temples pulsed. He was a prince, but also a man who slept and woke and carried whatever he carried. She felt the danger in what she would do. It was not only the danger to her body, but the danger of being seen, of becoming a story told when candles were snuffed and people whispered in the next room. A maid who made the air look at her. A maid who thought her spine mattered. A silly girl. An example. Her mouth opened. I will not. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. They slid into the room like a thin blade and then lodged, vibrating. The first sound after them was a sigh from someone who had been holding breath long enough to grow lightheaded. Then a rustle as a woman shifted and a man whispered an exclamation, and a footman coughed into his gloved hand to cover it. The boy made a small noise in his throat. The guard tightened his grip, not unkindly. A scrape of leather. The prince had not moved during her refusal. He did not flinch. He studied her face with a stillness that felt like pressure on the bones of her cheeks. There was no obvious anger there. No flash of temper. That frightened her more. You will not, he said, soft as a man repeating a line because he likes the taste of it. You will not. Clara kept her chin level. Her knees shook privately, a tremor she pressed out through her heels into the stone. She wished suddenly, fiercely, that she could think of something clever to add, something that would make the room laugh and the danger dissolve like sugar in tea. Her mind offered her nothing but the pounding of her heart. A noble somewhere behind the prince shifted, and the scrape of chair leg bit at the air. The prince's head turned a fraction toward the sound and then back. In that moment's side glance, Clara saw something she had not expected to see, not mercy, curiosity. He was curious about her. The thought made heat rise under her collar. Curiosity could turn to cruelty with no warning. It could turn to something else, and that was more dangerous still. This is my house, he said, very controlled. The reply came in her before she could stop it. It is where I work. The line snapped, invisible between them. The room felt crowded with all the eyes trying to listen without being seen to listen. He stepped closer. Not to threaten by distance, merely to narrow the space until she could smell the starch in his linen and a hint of something sharper, like citrus. She told herself it was only his valet's doing, not anything human. She wished that telling helped. Do you know, he asked, what happens when someone refuses me in my own house? She did not answer. She did not know. She knew stories. She knew punishments. She knew the way a year could be ruined by the wrong name on a list. She knew a body could be safe and a whole life still be ragged. The boy's cap slipped from his damp fingers and hit the floor with a small, flat sound. No one moved to pick it up. Mercy, someone murmured from the seats to the right, meaning it as a moral to the prince or a hope to the room or a test to themselves. Words like that were allowed only if they could not be traced to a mouth. The prince put his attention back on Clara, as if no other person existed. Attention like that was as good as being touched every place a gaze could reach. She felt her skin heat, and the heat scared her because it told the truth. Fear and something else in the same breath. Something like gratitude for the fact that he had not sent her away yet, that he was listening, that this line in her might be seen by someone with the power to grind it down, and chose not to for a second. Her throat tightened. She said, because it would not be swallowed, I am not yours to command in that way. A woman clicked her tongue, a little whip strip of sound. A man laughed in disbelief and then behaved as if he had not. The prince's jaw went precise. Something old and practiced moved beneath his calm. He lifted his hand, not fast, not slow, and reached past the point where a hand would stop if it were making a gesture. He did not touch her. His fingers hovered as though testing the temperature of her cheek from inches away. His eyes watched hers. Hers did not drop. "You will kneel," he said. And the last word came out heavier than the ones before it, as if even he had tired of the game, and now only the outcome mattered. "No," she said, the slightest tremor shivering the sound. Silence spilled, thick and hard to walk through. The boy took a breath and held it, a small, stubborn act in the back of the room. The prince lowered his hand. It fell to his side, empty again. He looked almost thoughtful for a heartbeat, and in that space Clara felt a strange, mad hope that something might change, that he might step back, that the room might breathe, and the candlestick might be considered a flaw in polish rather than a crime. Then he took one step more and the hope flattened itself. "You mistake yourself for something other than what you are," he said quietly enough that the words would have to be repeated by a dozen mouths later to travel, and each repetition would make them better. "You mistake me too." She did not know what he meant. She did not dare ask. She remembered the first time she had scrubbed this floor and thought of it as mute stone. It had always been listening. It had always been learning the sound of people who walked on it. It knew what trembling meant. It knew what a decision sounded like. "Do you persist?" he asked. And the courtesy in the phrasing made her want to scream. "I do." He breathed in once, a slow draw, and in that breath the room seemed to tilt, as if they stood on a ship and a swell had just raised one side. Clara's palms dampened. She resisted the urge to wipe them on her apron. She did not want to give him the spectacle of her trying to rid herself of fear like water. He turned his head slightly toward the nobles, toward the boy, toward the servants who had shrunk into the tapestries. He looked back at her, as if choosing his next word was something he would do while watching her eyes to see if she would flinch. She did not. His hand dropped to his hip, where the sword hilt gleamed with jewels that looked like cold berries caught in frost. The leather creaked, and the whole leaned forward as one body as his fingers tightened around it, and he took a single, measured step toward her. He did not draw the sword. He let his fingers rest on the hilt, as if he were reminding himself it existed, then loosened them and kept his gaze on the girl who had refused him. Edward tasted the silence on his tongue. It tasted of beeswax and the iron of held breath. She stood straight, hands at her sides, the line of her spine unbroken. Fear lived in the minute flicker of a pulse at her throat. It did not reach her eyes. He stepped close enough to see the fine damp at her hairline. "You test the patience of a room built to swallow such things," he said. Her mouth did not move. Her chin ticked a fraction higher. She heard him, and that was all she would grant. He could have broken her. He knew a dozen ways to do it without lifting a finger. Some learned from tutors who believed in discipline as an art. Some learned from watching his father turn men into instruments. He felt the coil of pride rise, ugly and familiar, ready to demand satisfaction for the trespass she had made with 3 quiet words. But something in the set of her jaw made that coil falter. She would kneel if he chose to grind her down, yes, most bent. But her kneeling would not blot out the image of her standing. This room would remember, and so would he. He recognized that dangerous certainty, and recognized too the unhelpful stir of curiosity that had no place beneath a canopy. "Bring the boy forward," he said, the command landing flat and crisp on the air. The guard urged the youth 2 steps ahead. The cap lay where it had fallen. No one had moved to retrieve it. Edward looked at the candlestick on the tray, and then at the servants along the wall. He could feel the court leaning toward him, not with respect, but with appetite. They wanted punishment. They wanted spectacle that cost them nothing. He lifted a hand. Enough. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The hall received it like a tide reversing. His expression did not shift, but the angle of his shoulders altered into what courtiers had learned to read as decision. "The hearing is closed," he said. "Return the candlestick to its place. The boy is dismissed." A small storm of whispers rose, shocked at the sudden end, but died as quickly as it began. The guard's grip slackened. The youth made a sound that might have been relief or a sob, and swallowed it whole. The footman with the tray looked between the silver and the dais, uncertain for a breath, then began to move toward the aisle. Edward did not look at the boy again. He looked at the maid. She had not moved since he approached her. The refusal still hung between them like a wire. "Mercy today," he said, "but not to her, to the room. Because I choose it." The message was simple and precise. Let them tell it that way. Let them forget the reasons and remember only the act. He could feel the push and pull of opinion around him, the tightening lips of those who thought him soft, the eased breath of those who would call him magnanimous over supper. He did not care. He cared that a line of power be drawn, and that everyone present see whose hand held the chalk. He turned from the maid long enough to face the assembly. "You have witnessed my judgment," he said, as if the hearing had contained more than a few minutes of interruption. "Carry it with you, as instruction." They rose. They bowed. They made of the moment what they needed, which was a story to tell without consequence. Shoes thudded softly against stone as the nobles began to drift toward the doors, their faces powdered into blandness. Servants stepped back into the paneling as though the wood might swallow them. Edward did not dismiss the maid. He let her stand with the knowing that she would not be allowed to decide her next step. He waited until the aisle was mostly clear, until the worst of the eyes had turned away. Then he looked at her again. "Clara Whitlow," he said, recalling what he had glanced once on a roster and tucked away, the kind of knowledge a prince was expected to carry without effort. Her lips parted in surprise that he knew it. Her expression smoothed again. "Your Highness." "You will serve at my supper tonight," he said, "in my private chamber." It was not a request. It was an invitation made of iron. In the old language of the house, it held many meanings: proximity, discipline, a lesson. A promise of his patience, or his attention, or his power, depending on who repeated it in which corner. Her throat moved as she swallowed. The pulse leapt again. "As you command." "Attend to your duties," he said, and lifted his hand in a dismissal that included every soul still standing in the hall. He turned away first. It mattered. He did not watch to see if she lowered her head. He did not want the victory of that. It would be smaller than the fact that she would come when summoned and enter a room where no maid should speak out of turn. That would be the field on which he could set the terms again. As he ascended the steps, his hand brushed the sword hilt in a movement that was almost idle. He did not need it to draw blood. He sat, and the chair accepted him, the canopy shadowing his face. A steward hurried forward to gather the remnants of formality, to gesture to the people who needed gesturing. Edward did not look at the steward either. He looked at nothing for a long moment, and then everything at once. The hall felt smaller now, or he felt larger. Or the thing inside his chest did, the thing that had uncoiled when the girl refused to kneel and had not yet settled back into sleep. He told himself the choice he had made, mercy visible, discipline deferred, would serve the crown better than fury. He had not spared her. He had set the board. He rose again, not because ceremony required it, but because restlessness did. The last of the court was drifting through the doors. He could hear the first burst of voices beyond, as if the dam had finally given way and the stories rushed out, already changing as they ran. He flicked a glance toward the wall where the servants stood. The line had thinned. The girl remained. 2 footmen hovered near her, uncertain how to approach a flame that had revealed itself in human shape. He gestured, a small movement. The senior of the 2 stepped forward at once, instinct overriding doubt. See her to the steward, Edward said without turning his head. He will instruct her. Yes, Your Highness. He left the dais by the side steps, the ones he preferred when he had no wish to be crowded. The corridor beyond was dull stone and dimmer light, and it held the comfort of fewer eyes. His breath went out, his jaw unclenched. He walked with his hands behind him, the habit of a boy drilled into a man and turned into a posture that spoke of thought to anyone watching. The echo of the maid's voice followed him down the passage. I will not. The words were not a jest. They were not a strategy. They were a piece of bone. He wondered, in a brief, unhelpful flare of curiosity, what else in her was made of that same white strength. He stopped the thought. He had invited her to his table for a reason. He would not let the reason be muddied by interest. He would demonstrate that boldness under his roof could be contained, that his notice was a thing to dread, not to court. He pressed his fingers to his temple once, an old habit when the room's corners felt too bright. Then he moved on, the sound of the hall behind him swelling and receding like surf. The doors closed. The great chamber became a place for whispers to multiply. Clara did not breathe at first. The air would not come. When it did, it came in a rush that made her chest ache and then settled into the shallow rhythm of a person who must not draw notice. The footman, sensing the change from spectacle to routine, stepped toward her with care as if approaching a skittish animal. Miss Whitlow, one said. And the use of miss was the odd courtesy servants sometimes offered each other when a prince's eyes had been on one of them. If you please. She nodded because nodding cost nothing. Her knees felt like joints that had been worked too hard. She did not look to either side as they led her down the aisle. She kept her gaze on the floor and on the place where the boy's cap still lay. No one had picked it up. She veered a step. The footman's hand hovered near her elbow, but she crouched and took the cap in her fingers and stood again, moving as smoothly as she could. The cloth was damp and warm from a hand that had gripped it in fear. At the threshold she saw the boy, pressed back against the wall as if to make himself thinner. His eyes jumped to the cap and then to her face. He seemed too shocked to speak. She placed the cap against his chest and closed his fingers over it. His mouth opened. She shook her head once. He swallowed and disappeared into the current of servants who could now move again. They took her into the side passage, where the light dimmed and the air cooled by a degree. She had walked these corridors in the small hours, lamp held low, when the palace belonged to mice and people who rose before dawn. They did not feel like the same corridors. Their brick felt like something else now. Not a path, but a funnel. He wants you for supper, the footman said, because silence was heavy and had to be cut by something. You will be told what that means. She kept walking. I know what serving means. His mouth tightened. You know one kind. This is different. She did not ask how. Questions invited answers, spoken with relish. She preferred not to give him the pleasure. They reached a door behind the dais that led to the steward's room. The steward would have a face like a ledger, she thought. Calm and grey and full of numbers. He would tell her where to stand and when to speak and what to lift and how to hold her eyes. He would say as little as possible because he believed instructions kept people from becoming stories. The footman knocked. A voice within called permission. The steward sat at a narrow table with a quill in his hand. He did not look surprised to see her. The news had outrun her steps, as it always did in houses like this. Whitlow, he said, his eyes flicking up and then down to whatever list he kept. You will report to the private chamber at the hour set for dinner. You will receive a tray. You will pour. You will speak only if spoken to. You will keep your eyes on the task and not on the company. She stood straight and listened. The words landed and made their little indentations in her mind, like the pricks along the edge of a key. The prince will sit at the head, the steward said. He did not look at her when he said prince. People who dealt with power daily learned to say the word like any other. You will take instruction from the footman posted near the door. If you err, you will not err twice. He laid down his quill with care, set it parallel to the edge of the paper. "You are dismissed until that time. Do not." He paused, as if choosing whether to weigh the next word with meaning. "Do not be seen more than you must." She pressed her palms together to stop herself from wringing them. "Yes." The footman moved to open the door for her. She stepped back into the corridor, and the air felt narrower still. She knew she should return to her ordinary tasks. She had a floor to scrub, linens that wanted folding, grates that ate ash and gave back soot. Work steadied the hands. Work turned hours into something you could carry. But as she moved down the passage, the ordinary doorways looked strange. The familiar sequence of turns did not lead where it always led. Every corridor led toward a room she had never seen except in the glimpses when she passed with a tray, and the door had been ajar by a hand's width. The prince's private chamber, where carpet swallowed footsteps and candles had the space to throw light without crowded heat. A woman she knew in passing caught her eye and then dropped it quickly, as if eye contact could spread contagion. Another brushed too close and then flinched away as if the brush had burned. A third, older, gave her a look that held pity, curiosity, and the kind of accounting people do when they try to guess whether your misfortune will touch their wages. Clara kept her face quiet. She entered the narrow staircase that led down to the servants' hall, where a pot always simmered and a bench always had a dent that fit a weary back. The sense of onion and fat rose to meet her. The sound of a knife on a board built a rhythm that was almost soothing. She stood at the threshold and let it wash over her for a breath. Then she moved on. To sit would be to think. To think would be to consider the way the prince had looked at her, not angered, not amused. Something else. She did not want that thought in her head, where other people could see it in her face. In the laundry room, steam lifted in low clouds. A girl tied up her sleeves and plunged forearms into a tub, red with heat to the elbow. "Clara," she said without lifting her head, because the room had as many eyes as people and someone had told her already. "You're to serve him." "I am," Clara said. "Be careful." Clara smiled a little. "How?" The girl laughed softly. "I don't know. I only know what to say." Clara took a folded sheet and set herself to smoothing it. The movement brought her back into her body. She worked the corners like a puzzle and felt the relief of being useful settle into her hands. Minutes passed that could be counted. The steam made stray hair stick to her cheek. She blew at it and kept working. Behind the steadiness, a different rhythm thrummed. She could not name it. It felt like drums beyond a hill you could not see. It made the skin of her forearms prickle with a readiness she had not invited and did not quite want. It had begun when she said, "I will not," and had intensified when he said, "my private chamber." It was not fear, though fear threaded through it. It was not hope, though something like the edge of hope cut at it now and then. She imagined the supper room, a long table, fewer chairs than in the great hall, more light set closer. Men who sat as if the chairs existed to be commanded to hold them. A prince at the head, whose attention could make a person feel flayed. She had stood in rooms like that as a shadow. She had never been called to the center of one. She pressed her palm along the sheet and it went flat under her hand, obedient and smooth. "You should eat," the laundry girl said without lifting her eyes. "If your hands shake later, it should not be hunger." "I will," Clara said. She did not. The thought of food sat wrong. She drank water, and it tasted like the tin of the dipper and steadied the place in her throat where words had scraped as they came out. The footman appeared at the door as discreetly as a shadow stepping into light. He did not need to speak. She wiped her hands on her apron, wiped the apron across her palms again, and followed him. He led her along a different corridor than she expected, one that ran along the spine of the house. The windows looked into an inner court, where grass lived under the shade of stone. The day had not moved much. She could have sworn it had been hours. It had been minutes. Bells did not ring here. Time was kept by feet, and by the way sunlight shifted on carvings. Her steps made no sound. She had learned that. But today every tread vibrated up into her knees. She kept her eyes ahead. The footman's back was straight. His queue lay precise against his collar. At an intersection, a pair of nobles swept past in conversation, not seeing her. Their words skimmed the air like thrown stones. "Refused," one said. "Imagine." "He'll make something of it," the other replied. "He always does." The syllables dropped behind them and lay on the floor like fruit fallen from a tree. The footman glanced back once, not to check that she followed, but to measure her composure. She gave him the smoothness of a maid who had survived 3 years without missing a step or a courtesy. He looked away, satisfied or indifferent. They reached the corridor that led to the private rooms. Doors here were thicker. The carpets dulled even the footman's tread. The candles burned in steadier air. A portrait at the end showed a man with a face like marble and hands like a clockmaker's, delicate and precise. She did not look at it. The footman stopped at a small door beside a larger one. The small door was for staff. The larger was for the man himself. He put a hand on the latch of the small door and paused, as if to give her the courtesy of readiness. She nodded once. "Remember," he said, quiet for the sake of the corridor. "Eyes on the task. Speak only if spoken to." She inclined her head. He opened the door onto a narrow antechamber where a sideboard stood ready, linen laid and silver waiting in rows. A decanter of wine caught the light. The red within it looked thick as a thought that would not be shaken off. The air smelled of beeswax and the faint ghost of oranges. She stood in that scent and understood it now. Not a valet's whim, a choice. A man who wanted sharpness in the air near him. "Here," the footman said, indicating the place she would stand until summoned. "When the bell rings, you take the tray to the inner room. Do not cross the carpet unless the man at the door nods. Do not turn your back on the head of the table. Do not rush." She nodded again. He left her there with the silver and the folded napkins and the hum of a room that did not yet have a person in it, only a presence. She placed her palm on the linen and then lifted it away. She paced the length of the sideboard once, small steps, and returned to her place. The murmur of the palace ran beneath the floor like water in pipes. The footfalls of courtiers were a distant braid. Somewhere a door shut with a softness that still carried authority. She listened because it was all she could do. Her hands did not shake. She was proud of that. Her mouth was dry. She licked her lower lip and tasted the salt of her own skin. She thought of the boy and the cap pressed into his hands. She thought of the prince's eyes on her, not angry, not kind, measuring. The bell on the wall gave a single clear strike that trembled the silver on the sideboard. The footman at the inner door lifted a finger without looking at her, a gesture that meant wait. He listened to something she could not hear, and then turned his head, finally letting his gaze land on her face. He nodded once, the smallest spark of permission. She lifted the tray. The weight steadied her. It was the old weight she knew, work weight, something she could trust. She breathed out and stepped forward, toward the door that separated the world she understood from the one where a prince sat and waited for what he had commanded. Clara entered the private chamber with a tray balanced against the soft of her palm and a body that felt as if it belonged to someone else. The door shut behind her with the hush of a secret vault. The room smelled of beeswax and wine, of lemon peel and old wood warmed by lamps set closer than they had to be in the public halls. Carpets swallowed her steps. The table, long and narrower than the great halls, gleamed. A few men sat in places that marked them as chosen, shoulders squared, smiles that lived in the corners of their mouths and nowhere else. She walked the length of the table with measured motions she had practiced until they fit her like the shape of a hand in a glove. Each plate had its appointed space. Each goblet waited for the careful tilt of poured wine. She moved not as someone watched, but as someone required to be unseen, even while doing everything. Her heart beat like a small drum. She concentrated on the weight of the tray and found, in that weight, a steadiness that kept her limbs from betraying the inner tremor. Prince Edward was at the head of the table. His coat drank the lamplight, making the fabric look like something smoothed beyond common hands. He did not smile. He watched the room the way someone studying a map studies lines and possible routes. His attention lingered on Clara as she set the first dish, not with hunger but with a careful appraisal, as if measuring grain on a scale. That attention was dangerous because it had no obvious intent. It could be amusement, it could be cruelty, it could be curiosity, the least safe of all. She poured wine into a goblet at his elbow and felt his gaze on the moving of her wrist. The heat of it rose through her like flame that did not burn, but singed, leaving a smell of something sharp behind. He inclined his head, the smallest motion, the kind that acknowledged competence in a servant, while reminding her that competence did not undo rank. The nobles around the table inclined their heads too, where they showed it mattered, and then resumed their muted commentary, voices low as if speaking too loud would invite damage. The conversation was polite at first, the curated sort. Books, hunting, the weather, as everyone who held land loved to pretend it was still the great thing that governed their lives. Laughter came in short, practiced clips, and was swallowed neatly by the room. Clara kept moving, answering only when required, offering measured phrases as one hands a fragile thing back to its owner. Beneath the polish, she listened. That was what a maid did when she served in a room like this. She learned what each man was made of by the inflection of his voice, the small catch when a subject scraped an old wound. Edward watched her, and, because he was practiced in holding intrigue at a distance, he began to test. A question slid from him across the table, casual in form. It was a thing easy to ignore, the sort of remark that could be a joke or a trap depending on who caught it. He asked about a minor point of etiquette, how a certain estate handled the dressing of a hair. It was an invitation to make others show their taste, to set the tone of the room. He watched Clara's hands as she set a plate down. He watched how she breathed between motions. She replied when addressed, the careful deference of her words layered with as little sign of herself as she could manage. Her sentences were short by habit, each one like a small coin placed into a larger chest. A look passed between two men across from him, almost a smirk. The prince's experiment worked. Attention turned toward the maid as if to test whether her composure would crack under scrutiny. Would the servant flinch? Would she confuse herself and their expectations by wanting more than the room could allow? Something untidy happened in the corner of the table, like the slip of thread from a seam. Lord Ashcombe, who had the appetite of a man perpetually calculating a gain, shifted the conversation toward loyalty. He spoke of honor, as if it were a commodity one might trade for advantage. He mentioned gentlemen who had carried banners and the cost of being judged by posterity. His voice held a neat malice that had been sharpened by years of courtly ambition. Those who listened smiled small, because reminding a room about loyalty was like placing a verdict in the hands of the people most pleased to pronounce it. The table leaned toward Lord Ashcombe's words, because scandal is a meal that wears well in polite company. Eyes flicked to Clara once, twice, with a hunger that lined itself under civility. She felt it like a draft across skin. Her hands moved as if they had been told to, pouring, clearing, smoothing the linen with movements that blurred intention and obligation. Yet inside her, something stammered. The name of her father, the thread of history stitched into her life, had been spoken aloud without her having given permission. That fact alone teetered her balance. Edward allowed the insinuation to hang, like an unfinished tune. He did not cut the thread Ashcombe threw into the room. Instead, he leaned back and made a small observation about the weight of accusations and how they clung to a name like Burr's. His tone contained both amusement and something cooler, a hint that he welcomed complications for their capacity to reveal character. He looked at Ashcombe with measured disdain, and then at Clara, as if appraising a blade by the way it caught light. Clara served the roast with hands that did not betray the quick cold that had passed over her. She had learned to be small. She had learned to deflect curiosity with a smile as thin as the silver she polished. Tonight she could not polish away the mention of her father. The word traitor had never been uttered in this room, but Ashcombe's phrasing brushed that edge and left a whisper of stain. Blood drying in the corner of a name. A treachery that no one thought to examine again. A noble near the prince spoke about military honor and the fragile line between bravery and recklessness. Men at the table nodded, because it allowed them to praise what suited their image. Their voices were like the soft beating of birds' wings. Clara listened and felt each syllable strike against her chest, as if the words had weight and the wrong side of history. She moved to refill one glass and met Edward's eye across the decanter. In that instant, she saw more than the public shape of him. She caught a flicker of something private. Fatigue around the eyes, the restless set of his jaw that did not belong to someone who slept easily. He asked her, in a tone that sounded simple, how she thought a household mended after accusations had been made. The question was not directed at her as a thought piece, but as a pressure. He intended to see whether she would retreat into silence or step into the wound. She answered plainly, without the elegance a court expected, with a word about work and honesty, and how persistence sometimes proved more of a thing than a coat of titles. Her voice was steady. It was enough. Ashcombe seized the pause. He threaded his inquiry between plates like a needle, making sure it came with a minor flourish that would draw the eye. He said carefully that some names never recovered, that some scandals made a family's line an object to be watched and used. The comment twined toward Clara's father without naming him and filled the space with a smell like burnt tallow. The other men listened like men listening to a game whose rules they already understood. Clara felt the room tilt inward. She kept placing dishes, setting slices of meat like measured measures of dignity. Inside, something tightened into a hard, precise ache. She wanted to speak then, to correct, to give the simple chronology of her father's service and the way he had been blamed for things he had not done. She felt the truth in her mouth like a stone. The table held the room together with its lacquer and linen and the small clink of silver. She would not have been permitted to put the stone down there. Edward watched Ashcombe because he watched the ways men used words to displace others. His attention, however, had grown sharper. Where before his testing had been almost playful, now it had an edge. He did not want a public airing of her history. He did not want scandal near him. But he also did not want someone else to get the pleasure of dictating outcomes. He felt at the center of that small tightening an irritation he could not name. Was it for the maid? For himself? For the idea that he might be seen as weak if he allowed a whisper to turn into an accusation unchecked? He cut the conversation with the simple motion of setting his glass down a fraction of an inch too loudly. The sound mattered because it was controlled. All voices turned toward him. He made a remark about the futility of dragging private sorrows into supper. It was light in tone, but a man at the head of a table could lasso the room with a single word if he chose. His words pulled, but not to a point of resolution. He left room enough for rumor's breath to shift. Ashcombe smiled, not quite graciously. He had the patience of a man who believed the world would yield to cunning. He allowed his gaze to linger on Clara, as if seeing her in the right light might reveal the shape of his advantage. The other nobles resumed their small talk, but the air retained the sharpness of the needle's point. No one had accused her outright, and so the suspicion had the finesse to live in the pallor of a cheek or the tremor of a hand. Clara felt the weight of their gazes. She moved like a woman who had been taught how to hold a tray, even when something inside her wanted to move otherwise. Her fingers found the edges of a plate and did not shake. Her lips were dry. She would not be the object of their sport, she told herself. She would not let the needle lodge. She would keep the seam intact. Then, without ceremony, Edward pushed back his chair. The motion was abrupt enough to make a ripple across the table. Cloth shifted. A glass caught light and trembled on its foot. The room inhaled as one. He rose to his feet, his face cut into a line that told of decision. The nobles still had their smiles, but they were scraped thin now, unsure if they were to laugh or be cautious. Edward did not ask for silence. He created it by sheer force of presence. The chatter died, as if a hand had smoothed sound into silence. Clara froze with a plate half-balanced between hand and air. A drop of gravy hung like a tiny moon at its lip. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She had not meant to be dramatic. She had meant to be the quiet center of service, a thing that ensured the others could be dramatic without consequence. He stood alone at the head of the table, the lamplight turning the lines of his face into a map of something older. He looked at Lord Ashcombe with a glance that folded conversation into accusation. Then he turned his head slowly, the movement measured to let every pair of eyes in the room follow. His gaze settled on Clara, as if for appraisal, as if weighing not just the day's offense, but something that had been stacked into her like hidden coins. The chamber waited on his breath. The candles clicked and sang with the whisper of wax. Clara could feel the heat of a dozen gazes threading from his face to hers and back again. Her hands felt faintly ridiculous holding the plate of food that suddenly seemed absurd in context. She wanted to drop it and be spared the spectacle, and the thought was as quick and dangerous as desire. He spoke then, his voice clear enough for each ear at the table to catch the tone of command folded into something that might sound like curiosity or might sound like a verdict. It hung there, and it made the room smaller and louder at once. The men at the table leaned forward like predators learning a new scent. The supper ended abruptly as Edward pushed back his chair, his sudden movement silencing the chamber, leaving Clara frozen with all eyes upon her. Edward's chair scraped against the polished floor, the sound cutting sharper than a sword unsheathed. The nobles stiffened in their seats, their laughter strangled in their throats. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Clara stood at the far end of the table, a plate trembling slightly in her hand, heat pressing against her temples. She could feel the weight of every gaze pulling her down, yet she refused to lower her eyes. "Enough," Edward said. His voice was neither loud nor hurried, but it cracked the tension like a whip through smoke. He did not look at Clara again, though he knew she remained frozen. His gaze fell on Ashcombe, on the half-smile still playing across the man's lips. "You mistake my table for your hunting ground, my lord. Leave your dogs outside next time." Ashcombe's smirk faltered, but only slightly. He bowed his head with a muttered acknowledgement. He had not expected Edward to end the night here, though perhaps he should have. Everyone knew the prince had his father's temper, and even his attempts at mercy carried the sharpness of threat. Edward lifted his hand. "We are done. Leave." It was abrupt, a dismissal without the ornament of toasts or farewells. But no one dared protest. Chairs scraped, silk rustled, and the nobles filed out with forced grace, their faces stiff masks of courtesy concealing eagerness to carry this story into every salon and corridor of the palace. The servants followed, heads bent low, carrying trays as shields against the shame that still prickled in the air. Clara did not move. Her feet rooted her where she stood, though every nerve told her to flee with the rest. She set the plate down slowly, as if any sudden motion would break what fragile thread of calm remained. Edward remained standing at the head of the table. His gaze traced the withdrawing figures, watching who left quickly, who lingered, who dared to meet his eye. When the last noble slipped through the heavy door, silence dropped like a curtain. Only Clara remained, and the room seemed to shrink around the two of them. "Stay," Edward said, before she could step back. The single word pinned her where she was. Her breath caught, not from obedience but from the shock of being addressed when she had hoped to disappear into shadow. She folded her hands before her apron, forcing steadiness into her posture. Edward stepped away from the table, his boots soundless on the thick carpet. The air shifted with him, carrying the faint trace of citrus and smoke. He moved into the gallery beyond the supper chamber, the long corridor lined with portraits. He did not look back to see if she followed. He expected it. Clara hesitated. To follow him meant stepping deeper into danger, but to remain behind would be a defiance she could not afford. She obeyed. The door closed behind them with a heavy click, shutting out the remnants of supper, leaving only the gallery's cold echo. The torches along the walls threw restless shadows across the painted kings. Their eyes seemed to follow the pair as they moved. Clara's steps were careful, her pulse quickening in her throat. Edward stopped midway down the corridor and turned sharply. His face was taut, his composure held with the thin edge of restraint. "Do you understand what you risked tonight?" His voice was low, meant only for her. Clara met his gaze, though it felt like standing before fire. "I did not speak," she said softly. "You did not need to." He stepped closer. "Your silence had more weight than any words. And your father's name hung in the air like a blade." The mention made her chest tighten, her fingers curled against her skirts. "It was not I who raised it." "But it clung to you," Edward said. "Every man at that table now thinks of it, and every whisper will carry it further. Do you grasp what that means?" Clara held his stare, though her breath wavered. "That my father is still judged, though he is long gone. That I am still judged, though I have done nothing." The bluntness startled him. For a heartbeat, he saw not a servant, but a woman carved by her own defiance, refusing to let shame bend her back. It unsettled him more than Ashcombe's smugness had. He took another step, closing the gap until the torchlight glimmered in the strands of her hair. His hand lifted, stopping just shy of her face. He hovered there, as though the air itself were dangerous to touch. "You stood against me once already," he murmured. "Do you think you can stand against the court as well?" Clara's breath trembled, but her voice did not. "I think I can stand against injustice." The words struck harder than any plea. Edward's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. He was heir to a crown, yet this maid spoke as though truth itself were armor. He lowered his hand slowly, but the closeness remained, heavy and suffocating. "You presume much," he said. "You forget your place." "My place was given to me," Clara replied, quiet but steady. "It does not define who I am." Silence stretched. The portrait seemed to lean in, watching, listening to a duel not of swords, but of words sharper than steel. Edward's pride burned at her audacity, yet another part of him, buried beneath years of command and obedience, felt a dangerous flicker of admiration. A sound interrupted them. Soft steps, the faint brush of fabric against stone. Edward's head turned sharply toward the far end of the gallery. A shadow lingered near a doorway, just long enough to betray the presence of a courtier who should not have been there. Clara's chest clenched. Someone had been watching. Edward's expression darkened. His gaze followed the retreating shadow as it slipped away, the echo of hurried shoes fading down another corridor. He cursed himself silently for not noticing sooner. He turned back to Clara, his face now carved in grim resolve. "We are no longer alone in this," he said. His tone carried the weight of inevitability. Clara's fingers tightened against her apron. The echo of those footsteps still rang in her ears. Whoever had seen them would carry their version of this moment into the corridors of gossip, where stories grew teeth. Edward stepped back, his composure regathered. His eyes lingered on hers a final moment before he turned away, striding toward the far door with the clipped movements of a man who understood the price of being watched. Clara remained in the gallery, her heart pounding against her ribs. The torches flickered as if stirred by unseen breath. Somewhere beyond the door, a courtier's hurried footsteps dissolved into whispers that would soon take shape. Clara and Edward stood locked in confrontation, unaware that their private exchange had already become the seed of rumor. By dawn, the corridors of the palace carried whispers as if the stones themselves had mouths. Servants bent close to one another at water buckets, hands busy while voices stayed low. Nobles, dressed for morning audiences, let remarks slip with practiced nonchalance, each word designed to be overheard. The story changed shape with every retelling. Some claimed the chambermaid had openly challenged the prince in the gallery, others that she had been caught alone with him in intimate discourse. Whatever the version, Clara's name, spoken cautiously, sometimes not at all, now threaded itself through the court like smoke. Clara felt the shift before she heard the words. Servants who once greeted her with weary smiles avoided her eyes. Girls who had shared bread at dawn turned their shoulders when she passed. She carried out her tasks with the same careful precision as always, yet the silence that followed her was no longer ordinary. It was edged, watchful, as if proximity to her might stain reputations. Even the boy she had defended in the great hall now kept his distance, guilt flickering in his gaze before he slipped away into safer company. Her duties changed that morning. A message came not from a fellow maid, but from the steward himself, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. Clara was reassigned to the prince's private library to serve as reader and attendant when summoned. The announcement was delivered without explanation, but the look in the steward's eye suggested caution, part warning, part pity. Clara lowered her head, acknowledging, though her heart sank with the weight of it. A chambermaid's place was in linens and ash, not among shelves and letters. The new duty was no reward. It was a tether. The library stood in the quieter wing of the palace, its tall windows casting pale light across rows of leather-bound volumes. The air smelled of vellum, dust, and faint ink, a world away from hearth and kitchen. Clara moved through it with care, fingers brushing the edges of books she had no right to open. She stacked, dusted, straightened. When commanded, she would read aloud to the prince, her voice shaping words meant for his ear alone. It was an intimacy disguised as service, and it unsettled her more than scrubbing floors ever had. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the turning of pages. Clara reached the lower shelves where neglected volumes slumped against each other, their spines cracked with age. She pulled one free to dust it, and, as she did, a folded paper slipped loose and fell at her feet. She bent quickly, her fingers brushing the seal before her eyes recognized it. The royal crest, pressed deep into red wax, half broken. Her breath caught. She should have placed it back without looking, she knew that. Yet her hand moved almost against her will. She opened the fold just enough to glimpse the ink inside. The words struck like a blow, reference to a captain's treachery, the dishonor of service, the stain upon a family name. Her father's. His disgrace recorded in the same hand that ruled the kingdom. Clara's vision blurred as heat stung her eyes. The truth she had carried in silence all these years lay here, sealed and forgotten, like a verdict no one had thought to contest. Her fingers trembled around the paper. She wanted to read more, to take in every line, but footsteps approached across the carpet. Heavy, deliberate, unmistakable. She froze. The door opened, and Prince Edward entered. His coat was plain compared to last night's supper, but his presence carried the same authority. He paused when he saw her crouched by the shelf, the letter caught in her hand. His eyes sharpened. "What do you hold?" Clara rose slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The paper seemed to burn in her grasp. She could not answer quickly enough. Silence betrayed her. Edward stepped forward and took the letter from her hand, with a movement that was not rough but final. His gaze locked on hers, hard as steel. "You pry into what is not yours," he said. The accusation landed with the weight of judgment. Clara swallowed, forcing her voice past the knot in her throat. "It bears my father's name." "That is no excuse," he replied. His tone carried controlled fury, but beneath it, something else. Unease, perhaps, or a shadow of guilt. He turned the letter over once in his hand, then tucked it inside his coat. "These words were not meant for your eyes. They were written about my life," Clara whispered. She had not meant to say it aloud, but the words broke free, raw and shaking. "About the shame that has followed me into every room of this house." Edward's expression faltered for the briefest moment, then hardened again. "You presume too much. Do not forget your station." Her chest tightened. She bowed her head, not in submission but to hide the sting in her eyes. The silence stretched, filled only by the tick of the clock on the mantel. Finally he turned sharply toward the door. "Leave! Now! Clara obeyed, her steps quick though her body trembled. She pressed her palms together as she walked the corridor, willing her breath to steady. The letter's words clung to her, heavier than chains. That night, the palace blazed with light. A grand ball had been summoned, the assembly rooms filled with crystal chandeliers, gilded mirrors, and music that soared against the painted ceiling. Nobles in silks swept across the floor, their movements as rehearsed as their courtesies. But beneath the elegance, tension simmered. Clara's defiance and the prince's notice had already become the evening's unspoken entertainment. Edward stood among the glittering company, his posture taut, his gaze scanning the crowd with the vigilance of a man aware that every glance carried judgment. He held a glass of wine untouched, his mind still clouded with the image of Clara clutching that letter. He had wanted to dismiss the matter, yet the look in her eyes, hurt, defiance, and something dangerously close to truth, haunted him. And then, as if the evening itself conspired to wound him further, Lord Ashcombe raised his voice during a pause in the music. With calculated precision, he wove a remark about disobedience in the lower ranks, about servants who mistook themselves for equals. His words carried the shape of accusation, without the bluntness of it. Heads turned. Laughter pricked at the edges of silence. Clara, serving at the edge of the hall, felt the sting as if the remark had been aimed like an arrow to her chest. Her hands tightened around the tray she carried. She could not hide. The air thickened with attention. Edward's jaw clenched. He recognized Ashcombe's move for what it was. A strike not at Clara alone, but at him, the prince who had failed to silence a servant's defiance. He set his glass down, the sound crisp against the music's sudden hush. His eyes met Clara's across the room for the briefest instant. She stood still, tray in hand, gaze steady though her heart pounded. Ashcombe smiled faintly, savoring the moment. He had cast the stone. Now he waited to see the ripples spread. The crowd leaned in, their hunger sharpened, their whispers already forming. Clara's throat burned with words she could not speak. Edward's hand flexed against his side, the weight of decision pressing down on him. The ball had become a stage, and neither of them could step away. At the center of the glittering hall, Lord Ashcombe's insinuation lingered, the silence demanding resolution. And as the crowd held its breath, waiting for the prince to act, Clara's eyes fell to the polished floor, where her reflection trembled beneath the chandeliers. She knew the moment was no longer hers to control. At a grand ball, Lord Ashcombe publicly hinted at Clara's defiance before the entire nobility, dragging her into scandal. The chandeliers trembled slightly in their chains as the music faltered into silence. Lord Ashcombe's words hung in the assembly room like smoke that would not disperse. His smile, faint and deliberate, left no doubt that he had meant for every ear to catch the barb. Edward stood still at the center of the room, the eyes of the nobility cutting toward him with gleaming hunger. Some wanted fury, others humiliation. All wanted a story. His glass remained on the table behind him, forgotten, his hand tightening instead at his side. He could feel the heat rise to his face, not from shame but from the trap that had just been sprung before him. Clara stood among the servants near the wall, tray balanced carefully, though her knuckles whitened. The weight of the silver threatened to shake from her hands, but she held still. The eyes of half the court shifted from Ashcombe to her, measuring her silence, waiting to see if she would crumble under the sudden blaze of attention. She wanted to disappear into the marble floor, to become as invisible as the footman who never drew notice. Yet she could not. The sting of her father's name whispered in the air, the taint of disgrace revived for all to savor. Edward drew a long breath. He could not defend her here without admitting too much. He could not rebuke Ashcombe without stirring greater scandal. And yet he could not allow the accusation to fester unchecked. Every second of hesitation carved him into weakness in the eyes of his court. He spoke, his voice steady, though quieter than the crowd expected. Lord Ashcombe chooses strange subjects for a ball. Laughter rippled, brittle and insincere. Ashcombe bowed slightly, his smirk tightening. Strange, perhaps, but timely. Edward's eyes flicked toward Clara. Only a moment, only a fraction. But it was enough. The hall noticed. Whispers rose, quick and eager, feeding on the glance like wolves on fresh meat. Clara's breath caught. That single look tethered her to him in front of everyone, no matter how he might try to disguise it. Her chest ached with a need to speak, to tear the veil of insinuation with truth. Her father had not betrayed his post. He had not deserved the disgrace thrown on his name. The letter in the library had confirmed what rumor had only hinted. But to speak now, before this crowd, would be to strip herself bare, to throw her pain into the open jaws of men who lived for spectacle. Ashcombe's voice carried again. Some among us mistake silence for dignity, but silence can hide much. His gaze slid to Clara, unhurried, cruel. A loyal servant knows her place, and a loyal subject knows when to kneel. The word kneel struck the air like a thrown stone. It landed with a thud in Clara's chest, recalling the moment in the great hall when she had refused. The memory seared through her blood, mingled with the present humiliation. She straightened. The tray in her hands became an anchor. She lifted her chin, just enough that the court would see she would not bow her head. The gesture was small, but it was noticed. Murmurs surged like waves crashing against stone. Edward's eyes burned as he watched, torn between fury at Ashcombe's cruelty and a darker, more dangerous fire at Clara's quiet defiance. A violinist shifted uncertainly, bow hovering. No music would resume until the prince released the room from this spell. But Edward remained silent too long. That silence itself became another kind of answer. Ashcombe inclined his head, satisfied, his words having achieved their mark. The crowd, restless, began to hum with its own energy, whispers trading hands like cards. Clara felt it, the shift in the air, the knowledge that she was no longer simply a maid. She was a subject of scandal, and scandal in this place was more fatal than blades. Edward's pride, already wounded, recoiled. To protect her now would be to admit weakness before the wolves. His jaw clenched. "Remove her," he said, his voice flat. The order crashed into Clara like cold water. Two guards stepped forward, not rough, but firm. She did not resist as they approached. Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her tray back to the sideboard, before one of the guards took her by the arm. The nobles parted as she was led out, their silks brushing against her sleeves like fire against kindling. She could hear the whispers swelling behind her. Scandal, defiance, disgrace. She kept her head high, though her stomach twisted, though her chest burned with unshed words. Edward did not look at her as she passed. He stared into the middle distance, his face a mask carved from stone. But inside, his thoughts roared louder than the crowd. He had cast her out with his own hand, and the court had seen it. They would say he had mastered her. They would not know the truth, that he felt mastered by the memory of her gaze. Clara stepped into the corridor beyond the great hall, the doors shutting behind her with a weight that sounded like finality. The marble floor stretched before her, silent, echoing. The guards released her once they were beyond sight of the crowd. She stood alone, heart pounding, her body trembling with the enormity of what had just passed. Behind the doors, music began again, haltingly, as if the instruments themselves needed courage. The ball resumed, but Clara knew nothing would return to how it had been. The scandal was alive now. It would feed. She took a single step down the corridor, her knees almost buckling beneath her. The ribbon in her hair slipped loose and fell to the floor. She did not pick it up. Her hand pressed against her chest, steadying the rush of breath. Inside the hall, Edward's glass shattered in his grip, crimson wine spilling like blood across the white cloth. Clara was escorted out before the assembled court, her figure diminishing beneath the vaulted ceilings, while Edward's hand tightened on the armrest of his chair, his face pale with conflict. The ballroom's music returned in stilted fragments, bows scraping across strings as if musicians played with one eye on the door where Clara had been taken. Nobles resumed their dance, though the rhythm was broken, movements stiff with excitement disguised as elegance. Whispers traveled faster than steps, gathering at the edges of the room before circling back to the center like vultures. Edward stood at the head of the hall, his hand still wet from shattered glass. A servant rushed forward with a cloth, but he waved it away, eyes fixed on nothing. The silence he kept was its own answer. He would not acknowledge the girl again, not here, not now. Yet his chest ached with the sharpness of what he had done. He had cast her out himself. He had chosen duty over something he could not name. Lord Ashcombe approached with the grace of a man certain of victory. He bowed, his smile careful, polished. "A difficult but necessary command, Your Highness. The court will remember your firmness." Edward's jaw tightened. He wanted to strike the words from the air, but he forced his face into stillness. He gave no reply, turning his head slightly as though the matter were beneath his notice. But the burn of humiliation was in his blood. Ashcombe had trapped him, and he had fallen neatly into the snare. The music swelled louder, drowning unease. Couples moved again across the polished floor, their laughter painted, their eyes sharp. Edward stepped back from the dais and exited through a side door without announcement. He would not give them the satisfaction of reading his expression. Clara, meanwhile, was led back to her quarters. The guards left her without a word, unwilling to entangle themselves further in a matter already swelling into scandal. She entered the small room she had called hers since coming to the palace. A narrow bed, a wash basin, a single chair. Tonight it felt smaller than ever, as if the walls pressed in, echoing the judgment of hundreds of eyes. She sat on the bed, her hands folded tight in her lap. The ribbon she had dropped in the corridor had not been returned. Its absence left her feeling strangely undone. Her father's name had been dragged into the light again, her dignity stripped away before the court. She had spoken no word, yet silence had not saved her. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to steady the rush of shame. Yet beneath it was something else, an ache that was not only for herself. Edward's glance across the room, the hesitation before he gave the order, had spoken more than his command. He had been torn, and she had seen it. That knowledge was a dangerous seed, but it warmed her even as it frightened her. The hours slipped by in quiet torment. Outside her door, footsteps hurried past, fragments of laughter and talk carrying news from the ball. Clara curled her fingers into the thin blanket, willing herself not to listen. The door burst open without warning. Edward entered, his presence filling the small space. His coat was still bright from the ball, though his face was pale, his expression taut with unrest. Clara rose quickly, startled. "Your Highness, enough," he cut in. His voice was sharp, yet it trembled at the edges with something unsteady. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the corridor. For a moment he stood with his back against it, breathing as though he had come from battle. "You should not be here," Clara said quietly. "No," he admitted. He stepped closer, his eyes fixed on her as though she were the only solid thing in a world collapsing into whispers. "I should not, and yet I am." Her chest tightened. "You commanded my removal before them all." His mouth twisted, the weight of his choice pressing into the lines of his face. "I had no choice. Do you understand that? To protect myself, to protect you even, I had to." Clara's throat burned. "Protect me? You let them see me shamed. They would have done worse if I had defended you." His voice cracked, low and urgent. "Do you think Ashcombe would have stopped? That the others would not have torn you apart with words sharper than blades? I ended it the only way I could." She stared at him, torn between fury and a strange, painful understanding. His eyes held desperation, not arrogance. For the first time she saw not only the heir to the crown, but the man beneath, cornered by the very power that made him feared. "You live in duty," she whispered. And you expect me to believe cruelty is mercy? He flinched, as if her words struck flesh. I expect nothing from you. I cannot rid myself of the way you stood, the way you looked at me in that hall. His breath deepened, unsteady. Do you know what you have done to me? Her heart raced. The distance between them was only a step now. She felt the heat of him, the scent of wine and smoke still clinging to his coat. Her hands trembled, but she did not move away. You confuse power with desire, she said softly. Perhaps, he admitted, but I cannot tell the difference anymore. The silence that followed was taut, fragile. Clara's breath caught in her chest. She wanted to speak, to push him away, to tell him the cost of this dangerous nearness. But her lips would not form the words. Her heart betrayed her, beating wildly, not with fear alone. He lifted his hand, as if to touch her face, then stopped just short, trembling with restraint. The space between them ached with all that could not be spoken. Clara forced herself to break the silence. You must go. If anyone sees you here, they will, Edward said, his voice low. Already they whisper. Already my father hears. Ashcombe feeds them. Tonight was only the beginning. Clara's breath faltered. Then what remains for me? His hand dropped to his side, fingers curling as if he wished to strike the air. I do not know. But I will not see you destroyed for standing tall. The room felt suddenly colder, the shadows pressing close. Edward turned toward the door, his movements sharp with frustration. He placed his hand on the latch, hesitating as if torn between leaving and staying. A fist pounded against the wood from the other side. Edward's shoulders stiffened. A voice called through, urgent and breathless. Your Highness, the king summons you. At once. Edward froze, his hand still on the latch, his jaw tight. The king himself had demanded explanation. The knock came again, louder, insistent. Edward turned his head back toward Clara, his eyes dark with what could not be said. The king himself summons you, demanding explanation for the rumors about the maid who would not kneel. The pounding on the door came again, sharper, the messenger's voice cracking through the wood. Your Highness, at once, the king waits. Edward's jaw tightened. His hand slid from the latch but not to open it. He looked back at Clara, still standing by the narrow bed, her hands pressed against the coarse blanket, as if she could steady the world through cloth alone. Her eyes were wide, frightened but steady. You hear them, he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could catch it. It has reached him. Clara swallowed. Her throat ached with the words she could not find. Then there is nothing more to be done. He shook his head. There is everything, and all of it dangerous. The pounding came once more. Highness! Edward opened the door at last, meeting the eyes of the flushed messenger. He did not answer the summons aloud. He did not need to. His expression was enough. The boy stepped back, bowing hastily, and Edward left the room without another word to Clara. But as he passed the threshold, he let his gaze linger one last moment. She felt it like a brand on her skin, as if it said all he dared not. Then he was gone, his boots echoing down the corridor until the sound was swallowed by the palace. Clara sank onto the bed. Her chest heaved with a mix of dread and longing. She had wished only to defend a boy, to honor her father's memory, and now the king himself would hear her name. The thought chilled her. She pressed her palms against her face, but tears would not come. Fear had burned them away. Edward walked swiftly through the corridors, the torchlight throwing harsh angles across his face. He felt the eyes of courtiers already gathering, their whispers darting like knives behind their fans and sleeves. Each step carried him closer to the council chamber, where the king sat in judgment. He did not slow, though his heart thundered with a disquiet he could not master. The door to the chamber opened before him. He entered. The room was heavy with silence. Ministers lined the walls, their faces carved into stone masks of discipline. The king sat at the great table, his body frailer than in Edward's childhood, but his presence still immense. His crown was absent, but authority hung about him like iron. Edward bowed, not deeply, not humbly, but with the measured respect due to a father who was also a sovereign. "You summoned me." The king's voice was low, roughened by age, yet it filled the space. "I did." "Explain yourself." Edward kept his spine straight. "What charge stands against me?" "Do not feign ignorance," the king said, his gaze sharp despite the weight of years. "The court brims with it. A servant who dared defy you, a maid spoken of in every salon. And you—" his hand struck the table, rattling the quills. "You who let it live, let it breathe, until it has reached my ears." Edward clenched his fists at his sides. "She defied me, yes, and yet I stayed my hand." "A prince does not stay his hand," the king thundered. "A prince shows command. You have allowed insolence to fester. You have allowed your own name to be dragged in filth beside hers." Edward's chest burned, but he held his composure. "Would you rather I had crushed her before the court, made an example of her for daring to speak? I chose mercy." "Mercy?" The king spat the word like venom. "You chose weakness, and worse, you chose fascination." His eyes narrowed. "I saw how you looked at her at the ball. Do you deny it?" The accusation cut close. Edward drew breath, steady but sharp. "I deny nothing. I looked at her because she stood with dignity when all others would have bowed. She reminds me that truth is not the property of titles." The counselors stirred, unease crackling through the chamber. One cleared his throat. "Highness, the rumors already damaged the crown. To let them grow unchecked—" "Enough," Edward said, his voice slicing through the air. His gaze moved back to the king. "Let them whisper. I will not be ruled by gossip." The king's face darkened. "Gossip becomes scandal. Scandal becomes revolt. You play with fire, Edward." "I was raised in fire," Edward replied, his voice tightening. "Do not think me afraid to burn." The king's hand curled against the table. For a moment, the room was silent save for the creak of old wood and the crackle of the hearth. Then he spoke, quieter but sharper than before. "You will end this. Dismiss the girl. Cast her out of the palace before dawn. Do you understand?" Edward's chest constricted. The command was final, merciless. Yet he bowed his head slightly, just enough to preserve appearances. "As you wish." The king dismissed him with a flick of his hand. Edward turned, the chamber doors closing heavily behind him. The echo followed him down the corridor, heavier than chains. He walked until the hall bent into shadow, and only then did he let his composure falter. He pressed a hand to his brow, his breath rough. To dismiss her was to betray not only her, but himself. Yet to defy his father was to risk everything. The crown, the fragile stability of a nation, the thin thread of his future. Clara remained in her chamber, staring at the door as though it might open again. Each footstep in the corridor outside made her pulse quicken, her breath catch. She longed for Edward's return, though she feared it just as much. The ribbon she had lost haunted her, as if all dignity had been pulled from her hair and left behind for others to tread upon. At last, footsteps came. Heavy, sure, familiar. The door swung open once more, and Edward stood before her. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed with fatigue and fury. Clara rose quickly. "What has passed?" He closed the door behind him. His voice was low, strained. "He knows. He commands your dismissal." Her breath hitched. She had expected it, yet the words struck with cruel finality. "Then I must go." Edward shook his head. "No." He stepped closer, his hand brushing the back of the chair, though he did not sit. "I will not see you cast out like a thief. Not after what you have endured. Not after what you have shown me." Clara's chest ached. "And what have I shown you, Highness?" He looked at her, eyes burning. "That there is a strength beyond crowns. That dignity can outshine power. That I—" He cut himself short, pressing his lips together. "That I cannot bear to lose it." Her breath trembled. She wanted to reach for him, to touch the hand that hovered so close, but she held herself still. "If you protect me, you risk yourself." "I already have," he said. His voice cracked on the words. "And I will again." The silence between them deepened, rich with all that could not be said. Clara's heart beat hard enough to hurt. His presence filled the room, overwhelming, dangerous, irresistible. Edward stepped closer still. His hand lifted as though to touch her cheek, then stopped, trembling in the air. His eyes searched hers with a desperation he could not hide. "Tell me," he whispered. "Tell me you feel nothing, and I will let you go." Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. Her heart betrayed her, shining in her gaze. She could not lie. He drew in a sharp breath, his hand falling to his side. He looked at her, as if the room itself might collapse between them. The silence was broken by a sudden pounding at the door once more. Clara flinched. Edward's head turned sharply, rage flashing across his face at the intrusion. A voice rang from the corridor, urgent. "Highness, the king demands your answer tonight. The decree is written. If she is not gone by morning, the council will call for sanction." Edward's breath caught, his body rigid with fury and despair. Everything seemed lost. Edward stood motionless, the messenger's words lingering in the air like the toll of a funeral bell. Sanction. The council had already prepared its weapon. By morning Clara would be gone, unless he bent to their will. The footsteps retreated down the corridor, leaving the chamber heavy with silence. Clara's breath came shallow, her fingers twisting against her skirts. She looked at him, eyes wide, waiting for his decision, though she already knew what it must cost. Edward turned slowly. His face bore no trace of the prince the court admired, no mask of authority, no polished restraint, only a man, stripped raw by choice. "They mean to end you," he said quietly. "Not for what you have done, but for what you represent." Clara's throat ached. "And you must let them." "No," he answered at once. "No. I have bent too long to silence. Tonight I will not." Her lips parted in protest, but he stepped closer, cutting off the words. "I will not let them brand you as shame, when you have carried more dignity than any lord in that room. If I lose favor, then I lose it. But I will not lose myself." The steadiness of his tone stilled her. Her breath caught as he took her hand, a gesture so simple yet so reckless it made her knees weaken. His grip was warm, trembling only slightly, as if both strength and fear lived inside it. "Come," he said. "If they wish to judge us, let them hear truth, not whispers." The council chamber had not yet emptied. When Edward entered again, Clara beside him, the hush was immediate. Courtiers who had lingered to feast on rumor turned like wolves scenting blood. The king's gaze cut across the room, sharp and merciless. Edward did not bow this time. He stood straight, his hand still close to Clara's, though not entwined. "You would have her dismissed in shame," he said, his voice ringing clear. "Then you must hear what you seek to condemn." The king's brow furrowed. "You dare bring her here?" "I dare," Edward replied, his tone measured steel. "Because you judge shadows. You repeat the words of men who profit from her ruin. Let her speak, and you will see." A murmur broke among the councillors, uneasy, startled. Clara felt her chest tighten, yet Edward's gaze steadied her. She stepped forward, every movement echoing in the silent chamber. She did not bow her head. Her voice trembled at first, but gathered strength as it moved. "My father served this crown. He bore arms with loyalty. He died with loyalty. Yet false accusation stained his name, and with it mine. I have lived under that weight every day in this house. I defended a boy because I could not watch injustice happen again, not when it has already consumed my family." The words hung heavy. Ministers shifted, some with discomfort, others with doubt. Clara's eyes moved to the king's, unflinching. "I never sought to shame your majesty. I sought only to keep truth from drowning." If that is crime enough to cast me out, then so be it. But I will not kneel to falsehood." The chamber was still. Only the fire crackled. Edward's chest swelled with something fierce and unnameable. He stepped forward, his voice low but resonant. "She speaks more plainly than most who sit in this room. If we punish such honesty, then we crown only fear." The king's gaze shifted between them. His silence stretched long, a test that bent the air. At last he exhaled, slow, controlled. "You shame me, Edward." Edward's shoulders stiffened. "You shame me," the king repeated, "because I see in her the courage I once demanded of you. And I see in you a fire that I thought pride but now begins to resemble conviction." He leaned back, weary but unyielding. "So let the matter rest. Her father's name will be reviewed. Her service will continue. But know this." His eyes pierced Edward's. "Every act from this day forward will be measured not only as a prince, but as a man tied to her dignity. Choose carefully." Edward inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement more than submission. Clara lowered her eyes at last, not in defeat, but in reverence, relief loosening her chest. The council dissolved in murmurs, courtiers scattering with their half-born scandals, denied the feast they craved. Edward remained still until the chamber cleared. Only then did he turn to Clara. Her ribbonless hair framed her face, damp with tension. He reached slowly, as though offering choice, and she did not pull away. His fingers brushed hers, light but certain. "You stood," he murmured. "Before them all, you stood." Clara's breath shivered, but her gaze met his, steady once more. "Because you did not let me fall." The king's words still hung between them, warning and promise at once. But for the first time since this storm began, Edward felt the ground firm beneath his feet. He had chosen. And in choosing, he had found not ruin, but a truth fierce enough to endure. The scandal had not destroyed them. It had remade them. And as the council's torches dimmed behind them, Edward and Clara walked side by side into the long corridor, the silence no longer heavy with shame, but with the fragile weight of something like hope. The corridor received them with its long breath of stone and candlelight. The night held close behind the windows. Edward did not speak at first. The noise of the council, the scrape of chairs, the rustle of papers, the measured outrage and reluctant concessions, still rang in his blood. Beside him, Clara walked with quiet steps, her gaze forward, posture straight. Hope was a fragile thing. He felt it between them like a flame a breath could drown. He slowed when they reached the turn into the gallery. Firelight trembled along the gilded frames of old kings. Here was where he had cornered her once, where pride had spoken in his voice and iron had lived in his hand. He stopped beneath a portrait of a man who had worn obedience like armor and had died of it. The memory tasted bitter. He did not wish to be that man. "Walk with me," he said. She nodded, and they moved farther into the long hall, their steps soft on the carpet runner. The torches made quiet exclamations as they burned. In the distance, the palace lived its low, late sounds, someone closing a door, a servant's careful cough, the brittle scratch of a quill that had not yet had enough. He turned to face her at last. The tightness that had lived at the edges of his eyes all day seemed to loosen when he looked at her. The council had not undone them. It had not, for once, demanded an offering of her dignity to save his. He felt that like a mercy he did not deserve. "It is done," he said. His voice felt different, speaking truth aloud. Not finished, but done enough for the night. Clara searched his face. The light found the places where exhaustion had hollowed him. "You stood," she whispered. "So did you," he answered. "You have stood from the beginning, Clara." Hearing her name in his mouth made something low in his chest pull tight. He did not let himself look away. He remembered the boy's cap hitting stone, the half-open letter in the library, The way she had said, "I will not," as if it were a prayer and a command. The memory made the old habits in him feel suddenly cheap. He drew a breath and reached into the inner pocket of his coat. Silk whispered against his knuckles. He had taken the ribbon from a velvet case in the antechamber before he found her again, an old strand of gold, once bound at the base of the ceremonial circlet he wore on nights of oath and treaty. It was not the crown, it was its echo, and tonight it was enough. He brought it out, a length of silk that caught flamelight, and threw it back in muted glints. He held it as one holds a thing that matters because of what it means, not what it costs. "Clara," he said, and the formality in his tone slid away. "This belongs to a duty that has often felt like a chain around my throat. Tonight, I want it to be a promise instead." She watched the ribbon, then his eyes. Her hands remained at her sides. There was distrust there still. Of the world, not of him. And he honored it by waiting. "I ordered you to kneel," he said. The words felt heavy. "You would not. You were right." He lowered his gaze for the first time. The movement confused the silence until it found a new balance. "If there is bending to be done, let it be mine." He offered the ribbon. For a heartbeat, she did not move. The gallery air felt charged. The distance between them rhymed with heat. Then she lifted her hand, palm open. The ribbon settled across her skin, a small, shining weight. She smoothed it without looking down. The silk was cool. It felt like history, like a house finally changing its mind. He watched her fingers, the neat strength of them. He remembered how they had held a tray steady when a whole room had tried to make her shake. He remembered the ribbon she had worn, plain, practical, tied with quiet pride. He had seen it fall, blue against marble, when the guards let her out. He had wanted to stoop in the hall like a common thief to take it up and keep it safe. "Wait," she said softly. She reached up to the loose fall of her hair. Without the ribbon, it had slipped from its ties. A few strands clung to the line of her jaw. From her pocket, she drew out a second length of cloth. Not the one she had lost. That one belonged to the corridor's indifferent stones now. This was another, older, worn thin at the edges, the last she had kept for herself when the others had frayed. She held it up, honest and plain in the gold light. "My ribbon," she said. He nodded once, and the muscles in his throat moved as if swallowing words. "Tie them." She stepped closer. The fine hairs at his temple shivered in the heat of their nearness. She brought the two ribbons together, gold, silk, and simple cloth, and aligned their ends. Her fingers worked with deft patience, making a knot that would hold without ugliness. The movement became more than craft. It became a quiet crowning, a joining not of rank, but of intention. When the knot lay neat under her hands, she lifted it into the light. The gold did not swallow the plain ribbon. It set it off. The simplicity made the preciousness less proud. The preciousness made the simplicity less alone. Edward let out a breath he had not noticed he was holding. He reached, then paused, then let his hand touch the joined ribbons. He felt the texture difference, the smooth and the sturdy, and felt, absurdly, like a man who had been given permission to stand inside his own life. "Clara," he said again, softer, "may I bend to you?" Her mouth trembled, then steadied. "If you choose it yourself." He did. He lowered his head. The crown he did not wear could be felt in the weight of the moment. He inclined not as a prince obeying etiquette, but as a man acknowledging the person who had made him step out of the old circle where power only circled back to itself. She lifted the joined ribbons and slipped them, with care and a held breath, around his bowed head. Her fingers brushed his hairline, an accidental touch that made heat rise under his skin. She tied the knot with a slow certainty at the nape of his neck. The silk cooled the warmth there. The plain cloth warmed it again. He closed his eyes. In the darkness, he saw the great hall not as a theater, but as a place where a different kind of order might be made. One built not on fear, but on recognition. It was, he knew, too simple. The world did not turn because one man learned to bow. But tonight, here, he could begin. He straightened. The ribbon lay against his collar like a vow. For a few breaths, neither spoke. The silence was not the old kind, made of restraint and watching. It was new. It made room. Clara looked at him, at the knot she had made. "I do not want to be an emblem," she said quietly. "I do not want to be a rumor with legs." "You won't be," he answered. "At least, not to me." He lifted a hand, slow so she could refuse if she wished. She did not. He touched a curl that had fallen against her cheek, letting it wind once around his finger and then slip free like a secret he would not keep from her. "To me you will be the person who said no. And to others." Her voice held a tiny smile, wry as a blade kept very sharp. "To others," he said, that same wryness answering, "we will give them a better story to tell." Her breath hitched at "we." It was a small word. It changed everything inside her. He glanced down the corridor. He had not forgotten the palace that held them, the ears that could grow overnight. He would not make promises he could not keep. Yet he could make one. He turned back to her, the gold and plain knot warm against his neck. "Walk with me," he said again. But the phrase had shifted. It was not a command. "Every day, as far as we're allowed." She nodded. "As far as we must." They left the gallery together. The portraits watched them pass. Somewhere in the wing beyond, a clock began to count the moments with patient ticks, as if to say that time, this time, would belong to them if they insisted on it often enough. They took the long way to the library because the library had begun all the breaking and the mending. He opened the door for her and stood back. She entered and stood where the sealed letter had once dropped from the shelf. The dust did not dare settle tonight. Edward crossed to the table and set his hand on it. The grain of the wood felt like the ridges of an old map. He looked at the shelves with their leather and their nameless, merciless ink. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will ask for the review promised. We will find what they wrote about him. We will pull from it what we can." Clara watched his mouth as he spoke. The shape of resolve there comforted her more than any oath could. "And if the review is a ceremony only, then we will go one step more," he said, "and another." She traced, absently, the groove a heavy book had impressed into the table over years. "You will spend yourself on this." "I spent myself on less before," he said, a rueful tilt to his words. "On the clatter of court, on making men like Ashcombe perform their manners. This seems worth my weight." She laughed then, soft and sudden, the sound washing the room like clean water. He closed his eyes to feel it better. "Tell me what you fear," he said, opening them again. She took a breath that filled her chest in a new way. Being made spectacle again. Being made grateful for crumbs. Being told to kneel with sweetness instead of threats. "I cannot promise sweetness will vanish," he said, "but I can promise I will not use it to make you smaller than you are." She moved to him without thought. The distance this time did not feel like a test. She stood close enough for the ribbon to brush the back of her hand. She lifted that hand and laid it lightly on his chest. There the beat was strong, a steady drum that had faltered tonight and then found itself. He covered her hand with his. In the library's quiet, the touch spoke more than any pledge. He bent his head, not all the way, just enough that the warmth of his breath crossed the space between them and made the air taste like possibility. "If I am to speak," he murmured. "I should choose words, I mean. I meant many today, but I did not say one." She waited. The pause was not cruel, it was ripe. "I love the person who would not kneel," he said. The sentence landed in her like a port after a terrible sea. She did not cry. It was not that sort of relief. It was the feeling a body has when it is allowed to belong to itself with witness. She smiled then, and the smile was not small. It made the room look different, as if the corners had been rounded by kindness. "Then stand with her," she said, and she drew breath as if she had been holding it since the morning of the hearing. "Every day." "Every day," he answered. The library door stayed shut. The candles held their careful flames. He lifted his hand from hers only to take her fingers properly, threading them in his. The gesture was gentle and complete. He guided her to the window where the panes threw back their pale reflections. Night pooled in the courtyard. The sky held no moon. In the glass, they saw themselves, a man with a prince's face made more human by a plain ribbon tied with gold, and a woman with a servant's gown made luminous by a refusal that had rewritten her fate. "We should sleep," she said after a while. It was practical. It was also merciful. "We should," he agreed, not moving. She looked down at their joined hands. "Release me," she teased quiet, "or I will think you intend to keep me here by force." He let her go at once. "Never by force," he said softly. "Only by asking." She reached up and touched the knot again, her fingers warm. "Then ask." "Stay close," he said. "Tomorrow, the day after. As long as I'm learning how to be worth this." Her eyes warmed. "You are worth it because you wanted to be. You did the work, you bent." He exhaled, a laugh from the chest. "And look at that. It did not break me." "No," she murmured. "It made you beautiful." Heat rose in his face, not the careful heat of rooms meant for display, but the unguarded kind one feels when seen without armor. He looked younger in it, and older, both at once. They left the library together. He would walk her to her door and then stand there an extra breath, because endings, even small nightly ones, felt significant now. In the corridor, the palace felt less like a machine and more like a house that, with patience, might come to its senses. At her chamber, he paused. He did not cross the threshold. They looked at one another as if learning a new language and enjoying the way even silence had meaning. "Good night, Clara," he said. "Good night," she answered. Then, after a heartbeat, as if giving him back something he had placed in her keeping, she added, "Edward." He closed his eyes because the sound was as sweet as the first time someone had told him he could put down the weight he had been carrying since he could walk. When he opened them, she was still there, the candlelight making a halo against the lintel. He stepped back. She lifted her hand in a small, sure wave. The door shut gently. He stood a moment longer, touching the knot at his neck as if to confirm it had not been imagined. A smile found him there. He went to his rooms and did not summon anyone. He undressed himself, a small act of private rebellion, and set the gold and plain ribbon on the table beside the lamp, where he could see it when he woke. Then he lay down and slept without the old dreams. Morning would bring its ordinary battles. He would meet them standing. In the gallery, the torches gutted out one by one, leaving the frames of kings to rediscover shadow. On the corridor floor, some night draft found a lost ribbon and slipped it under a baseboard as if returning it to the house. In the library, a sealed letter waited to be opened under lawful eyes. In Clara's room, sleep smoothed her brow and left her mouth soft with peace. Daylight would find a prince who had lowered his head and a maid who had refused, and between them a knot that was neither collar nor chain, but a promise tied by two steady hands. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.